Let me see a show of hands here. How many have ever been to the great state of Maine? Quite a few. Well-traveled group here, right? If you've been to Maine, of course, you know they don't talk too much up there. It's hard to get them in conversation. Some of them. Right? It's like the fellow, they asked him, the old fellow, if he'd lived here all his life, and he said, not yet. There's an old codger up in Maine there, and every day he comes down to the local newsstand, and he walks in, and he takes out the newspaper, and he looks at the front page, folds it back up, puts it in the slot, and goes out the door, day after day. Well, finally, the proprietor of the store, he grabbed him one day, and he said, I don't mind you doing that. He said, you're not ruining the paper. Somebody else can buy it. But he said, you're obviously looking for something. What is it you're looking for? Oh, he said, I'm looking for the obituaries. Oh, he said, the obituaries are on page 40. He said, not the one I'm looking for. I wonder who you're thinking of. How many here from Ohio? Oh, we got a pretty good representation here from Ohio. I understand one of your senators is going into space. If they can send one, can't they send them all, right? Some of you may have heard the story about the fellow who bought a house in a nice part of town, but the house had been vacant a couple of years, and it was kind of rickety, and it was, in fact, a mess. It was an eyesore in the neighborhood. So he took over the place, and he fixed it up. He put a new roof on. He fixed the shutters. He put a nice little picket fence around. He finally got a lawn growing and some flowers and everything. In about 2 years, it took him all this work. And now this place was now no longer an eyesore in the neighborhood. It was just a delight. So the Reverend came by one day, and he said to him, gee, he says, I want to meet you. He said, the Lord has sure been good to you. He says, is that right? He said, you should have seen this place when the Lord had it all by himself. Now, that's a message for birchers. We don't pray without acting. We do them both. We pray for good crops while we're hoeing, right? Right? Keep that up. Our first speaker is a Massachusetts native, graduate of Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Joined the John Birch Society and its staff in the summer of 1959. He was soon brought to the headquarters by Robert Welsh, who wanted to rely on his wisdom, his judgment, his loyalty, and Robert Welsh was never sorry that he asked this man to come and be his right-hand man. He was soon named to the council, the first member of the staff that had ever been named to the council, and then he was named president. He became the first president of the John Birch Society. He left the staff after a time and moved into a family business, still on the council, member of the executive committee. He's a man who is much revered by all of us for his good sense, his deep knowledge of the society, and everything that we would hope to find in a man who was at Robert Welsh's right hand for those years. Please welcome Mr. Thomas N. Hill. Tom?
Members of the council, members of the staff, members and friends of the John Birch Society. By every method of measurement one might adopt, I believe the results would offer the same appraisal of this undertaking we know to be the John Birch Society. Quite candidly, it was not supposed to celebrate its 10th anniversary, let alone its 40th. I would offer as well that this assessment is one which the Society's adversaries confidently believed for many years. Barely after its birth, the Society was defiled and vilified by the most far-reaching and pervasive smear campaign perpetrated upon any voluntary organization in this century. The pressures alone to undermine the Society's leadership, that is, the leadership of Robert Welch, were unbelievably foul and dirty. Along the tumultuous way in the earlier years of its history, a few who were thought to be friends were taken in by the smears and falsehoods and parroted them out of ignorance or arrogance or both. Who could forget the pronouncements made by Mr. Conservative Republican himself? Members of the Society I know are good people, he said. It's the leadership of the Society that needs to be changed. Imagine, Mr. Goldwater apparently never did figure out that those good members he vouched for joined the Society precisely because they believed in, supported, and agreed with its leadership. Yes, some are familiar with those times in our history, yet many are not. And for both who are and who are not, for that matter, it seems appropriate this evening to touch upon our past as a way to reinforce us for what most certainly is to be a rough and hard-fought future. For a period of 25 years, our founder was labeled by foe and so-called friends alike a disciple of Hitler, a Welcher, an anti-Semite, an atheist, a Rockefeller insider, a communist, and the list is endless. The widespread attacks were for the purpose of having him dismissed as a crackpot by an uninformed and disinformed public, as well as by sufficient numbers of our own members. The attacks were worldwide in reach and scope. These pressures were often coupled by attempted coups from within, usually led by not terribly gifted opportunists who saw for themselves elevated importance within the organization as a result of any shuffling they could bring about near or at the top of the organization. In the early days, you even had would-be insiders scrambling across the countryside, trying to convince members of our council to renounce Robert Welch and otherwise desert the Society. It is with interest, as we look back and remember the actions of one such individual, William F. Buckley, to be exact, traveling to Indiana for the purpose of convincing Pat Mannion to divorce himself from the Society's leadership. And I think Mr. Buckley made the grade as far as his anxiety to be in the gates of the insiders. A few succumbed to the myriad of pressures, but most, thank God, resisted them and stayed aboard the ship. Again, my friends, it was the intensity and diversity of the attacks that perhaps more than anything else makes one wonder how on earth the organization survived. Not only did the Society survive the wounds inflicted upon it, but a very solid and dedicated core of members emerged more determined than ever to relentlessly explain the truths of the John Birch Society and to correct the falsehoods that had been spread about it throughout the 60s. The 70s presented still other challenges, some quite different from the earlier years. Basically, these were the Nixon-Ford years, times when too many Americans were lulled to sleep by voluminous conservative rhetoric. Well-informed conservative anti-communists were faced with the frustration of trying to push away the smoke screens in order to expose the actions of traitorous administrations. As perhaps the best example of what we are talking about was the sellout of Taiwan and the bonding with Beijing engineered by the Nixon-Kissinger axis. As we look at the consequences of those actions today, we can clearly recognize how they have led to disastrous consequences for the entire free world and for the poor Chinese people themselves. The decade was a frustrating one for our crusade. Although those frustrations quickly dissipated, what with the Carter years towards the end of it, the Carter window, where no longer meaningless conservative rhetorics served as a protective smokescreen for widespread progress by the insiders, allowed ample opportunities to create real understanding and to promote Americanism and Americanist principles on a wide scale. It was in the early 80s, my friends, what with Mr. Welch's health deteriorating, that a new kind of threat faced the society. This was not a threat to destroy the society, but to change it, to alter its structure, its methodology, and yes, its very name. It was to be moved to Washington, D.C., and aligned closely with a number of national organizations there, very much including those which had become known as part of the New Right. The end result of this effort, had it been successful, would have clearly placed the society as a whole far closer and in bed with the Washington-based political scene. Ladies and gentlemen, the skids were well greased. After the murder of Larry McDonald, pressures to realign our undertaking continued to the point where offers were made to leaders of the New Right, individuals who themselves had never been members of the John Birch Society, to become successors to your founder, Robert Welch. Though tired and frail, Robert Welch stood up to these plans. Quite forcefully, he admonished some of his former friends who were backers of the scheme, and as a result, a key result, brought encouragement to our staff in our offices and in the field, and to knowledgeable members throughout the country. Later, as a result of the very determined actions of our staff and a sufficient number of our council members, the doors to this scheme were slammed shut. So you might ask again, why does he cover this painful ground? And my answer, once again, is to show as convincingly as I can that our adversaries, in all their disguises, hadn't planned for you to be celebrating the 40th anniversary of the John Birch Society. Looking at it from another standpoint, over that 40 years period, the conspiracy's timetable for taking over the country and the planet had been badly disrupted. 1976, 1987, 1989 have come and gone. And believe me, they rely on anniversaries very much indeed, as Mr. Welch told us. This should be of encouragement to every single puller at the oar within our ranks. It is testimony to those millions of grains of sand of resistance placed before the rising collectivist tide by hundreds of thousands of good, informed, and relentless members at all levels of this undertaking that has proven what Robert Welch reminded us of over and over and over again. A conspiracy cannot flourish under the light of scrutiny. At the 25th anniversary of the Society in Indianapolis, I introduced Mr. Welch at the evening banquet, and I told him how grateful we were for all that he had done for our country, for us, for our loved ones, and men and women of goodwill everywhere. What I thanked him most for was that by his forethought, by his undaunted willingness to do his part, by his determination to lead us, he had given the greatest of all gifts and challenges, the opportunity, yes, the chance to win. Thank God for his greatness in bringing such a man amongst us. And on a personal note, I thank the Almighty for allowing me to live beside our founder those many turbulent and productive years. So we turn to the 90s without Robert Welch, but yet I firmly believe with his heartfelt assurances that the Society's leadership and the Society as a whole are on the track he made for us. What are our chances? Set aside the Rockefeller, Clinton, Colonel House set for the moment. Let us assess our own. I look around this hall tonight and I see the faces of those who have stood tall throughout those many crises of our past. Council members and staff from all over the country, volunteer leaders and members with decades of service, and yes, of even greater significance. Many new members of our council, of new staff, and of new and enthusiastic members. Look what you have accomplished and be proud of it. Yet also clearly realize the responsibilities that are now on your shoulders. For those men and women, editors, writers, who put together our printed publications, I remind you that these are the soundest, most penetrating, and most informative of any that exist today by far. There are no comparisons to be made. None. Robert Welch would be proud indeed. For those members of our council, you have been and can be the key to providing widespread understanding and support for our undertaking and for our leadership. For members of our staff here in Appleton and throughout the country, you are all on the front lines, and you are achieving fantastic records of effectiveness as a result of your hard work and following the guidelines set forth by the leadership of the Society. Make no mistake about it. You are what makes the Society tick. You have proven that you are the glue that holds everything together. I say to you, keep on. As you probably have surmised, my assessment of our chances for winning is that we can make it happen. I should tell you that my personal enthusiasm for the prospects of victory never been higher. And I also should tell you that my renewed enthusiasm and activity after nearly 40 years of association with this undertaking is primarily as a result of the leadership of the senior staff of the Society that is in place today. With its share of crises to handle as before in the times of Robert Welch, it has performed admirably. Should be a source of encouragement to us all. Faint-hearted they are not. Determined they are. As we are about to enter another decade and century, we thank the Almighty for what He has allowed us to build and to use for the betterment of generations and generations to come. God bless you all. Thank you.